Hi.
Hi. I wanted to start by saying thank you, first of all, for doing the interview that we did 14 months ago. It's given this interview in the shape of the film, Power and Terror, has given many thousands of people an opportunity to think about what's going on in the world with a lot greater depth and perspective and engagement. We estimate that probably 100,000 people have seen the film in Japan, in the United States, Australia, Canada, and now in Europe. And it's still playing a year after it was finished to standing room only audiences. I'd like to start by asking you, now that 14 months have passed, a lot of events have taken place.
The invasion of Iraq was actually a piece of a much bigger picture. When we talked 14 months ago, we probably didn't talk much about it. The reason is that the great government media propaganda campaign about Iraq being an imminent threat to the survival of the United States, that began in September, a couple of months after we talked. And it coincided with two other crucial events. One was the announcement of the National Security Strategy on September 17th, which is not entirely without precedent, but it is something new. The Bush administration declared, quite frankly and brazenly, that they intend, the United States, their version of the United States, intends to dominate the world completely and permanently. That is, any potential challenge will be blocked and, if necessary, destroyed by the use of military force. The one dimension of power, and this is crucial, it's the one dimension of power in which the U.S. has overwhelming advantages. That's not true economically, and it's not true in other respects. It's a more complicated world. But militarily, the United States is in a class by itself, and it wants to use this. It's expanding its military force enormously in extremely hazardous ways, which are worth looking at. And the intention is to use that advantage to control the world. So that was announced in September. When you announce a policy, you have to carry out, if you want it to be taken seriously, you have to carry out what's sometimes called an exemplary action to demonstrate that you really mean it. And Iraq was chosen to be the test case, what the New York Times later called the Petri dish, in which the strategy is tried. Now, Iraq was a very sensible test case. To be a test case for this strategy, a country has to meet several conditions. One is it must be completely defenseless. It doesn't make any sense to attack anybody who can fight back. That's ridiculous. So it has to be defenseless, which of course Iraq was. It's one of the weakest countries in the region. It's devastated by sanctions. Its military expenditures were about a third of Kuwait's, which has 10% of its population. It was under complete surveillance. They knew where every pocket knife in the country was. So it was completely defenseless. That's point one. Secondly, it has to be important. There's no point intervening in, say, conquering Liberia. What are you going to do with it? Actually, it has some reasons, but not much. Iraq's extremely important. It's the second largest reserves of oil in the world. The United States will end up dominating a major sector of the hugest energy reserve in the world. It's dominated it for a long time, but this will advance it. This will, presumably, the U.S. will end up with military bases in Iraq. It's part of the shift of military bases towards the oil-producing regions. And that'll be the first real military base right in the oil-producing region, so that's very important. And third, you have to be able to portray the country as somehow the ultimate evil or threatening our existence or something like that. And that's possible too. All we have to do is listen to every speech by George Bush or Tony Blair, and they say, how can we let somebody survive who gassed his own population and invaded two countries and was developing weapons of mass destruction and so on, all of which is completely true, but it always omits the few crucial words. Yeah, he did all that, and we helped him. And we helped him because we didn't care. And we is the people now running Washington. And there was a third thing in September, namely the opening of the midterm election campaign. And that's connected. Karl Rove, the Republican campaign manager, one of the most important people in Washington, informed the party activists over the summer that if they go into the campaign and allow social and economic issues to be in the forefront, they're going to lose, because the social and economic policies are very harmful to most of the population and are very unpopular. So he said we have to focus the campaign on security. If you can frighten the population, they may rally around the man presented as a powerful leader who'll protect you from destruction, and then maybe we can hold on to political power. And that's exactly what was done. So you had those three things at once: the national security strategy, announcing a plan to dominate the world permanently by force if necessary, the test case, invade a defenseless country that's worth controlling, and three, try to maintain a narrow hold, very narrow hold on political power, so that they can ram through a extremely reactionary domestic agenda, which is basically rolling back the progressive legislation of the past century, literally, and very consciously, and serving the interests of very narrow sectors of power, very unpopular, but you can get away with it if you can frighten people. Iraq was used to frighten the population, and it worked. There was a major government media campaign. Within about a month, about 60% of the population thought that Iraq was a threat to an imminent threat to the United States. We had to defend ourselves from it. Around the world, that's laughable. Even Kuwait didn't believe that. In fact, no one did. But in the United States, it worked. Within a couple of months more, about half the population or more came to believe that Iraq was responsible for September 11th and that it's planning new terrorist attacks. And these views, as you'd expect, are very closely correlated with support for war, and that's understandable. I mean, if people think that there's this monstrous country about to destroy us, it already carried out the September 11th attacks and it's planning new ones, well, we got to defend ourselves. So that way they could get some support for war, not a lot, but some. It's hard to say. This is a very public relations-oriented administration. I mean, all administrations are, but this one unusually so. Every figure is carefully crafted, coming out of central casting with a particular role. And what they will, the Abraham Lincoln extravaganza is just a case in point. What they will probably do is just what Karl Rove indicated, create another extremely manufacture a dangerous situation. It doesn't take much to manufacture. It doesn't have to be real, like Iraq, whatever you think of it, was certainly no threat. But they were able to convince the country that it was a very serious threat, and if they have another one, then somehow the problems in Iraq people will forget about. Does anybody remember what happened in Afghanistan or Kosovo? You don't even know what they were. This goes way back, incidentally. I mean, when my children were in elementary school, around 1960, they were literally being taught to hide under their school desks to protect them from atom bombs. I mean, putting aside the absurdity, is there any other country where school children were being taught to hide from atom bombs? There's been major efforts here for years to frighten the population into obedience, and people are afraid of everything. They're afraid of aliens. Very large part of the population in the United States, maybe half, some large number, thinks there already are aliens among us, and they're going to try to destroy us. I mean, there's fear of the UN. there are large parts of the country where people are afraid that the UN is planning a genocide against the American people, and the reports of black helicopters with UN troops and so on. This is unique to the United States as far as I'm aware, and unscrupulous leaders can manipulate it. Crime, drugs, Nicaragua, Grenadian Air Base, Saddam Hussein, whatever it'll be next. But there are real issues in the background. It's not just controlling the American population that's required. You also have to control the world. There are, for 30 years now, the world has been economically what's called tripolar, 3 major economic centers, more or less on a par. Europe, North America, and Japan-based Asia. That was 30 years ago. It's changed since. It's now not just Japan-based, it's China-based, and so on. But these 3 areas are still there. If you look at the 3 of them, Northeast Asia is the most dynamic economic region in the world. Fastest growth, big industrial powers, Japan, China, South Korea, China becoming, Japan, South Korea already major industrial powers, plenty of resources. Siberia has lots of energy and other resources. It's a potentially integrated area. It actually holds about half the world's foreign reserves. So just in that respect, it's the most important of the 3 major areas. It's the gross domestic product. Northeast Asia is much higher than that of the United States, and it's growing fast. The United States is concerned about it. They're concerned about the integration of Northeast Asia. The North Korean issue is right in the center of this, and similar problems are arising in Europe. All of this talk about old Europe, France and Germany, we can get rid of them. That reflects fears that go back to the end of the Second World War, that Europe might move on an independent course. And if it does, it's going to be led by its industrial and financial heartland, namely Germany and France. Germany and France were bitterly condemned because the governments took the same position as the large majority of the population instead of following orders from Washington. In fact, the hatred of democracy that was expressed in the last few months has absolutely no parallel that I know of.